There are a few things that I wanted to discuss that were in these last two chapters that I feel are important for you to know. The first one was in chapter 9, and it was at the top of page 130. It talked about in the first full paragraph, so it talked about there about the 3-year reevaluation. When a student has an IEP, every 3 years they have a reevaluation to determine if they still qualify for services, if services need to be changed. It can be through formal evaluations, or it can be done through a review of the data that you have on students. In Iowa, this is done by the AEAs. On that first full paragraph, it started off, it said, since the student's last 3-year reevaluation was completed in 9th grade, it's now time to complete another 3-year evaluation. It says the importance of the 3-year reevaluation late in high school may be underestimated by the IEP planning team. Something I want to point out here is that that makes it sound like every student is going to hit 9th grade, they have the reevaluation, and then in 12th grade they have another reevaluation. And that's not true. I mean, it can happen if that's when the 3-year reevaluation falls, but I know of lots of incidences where that hasn't happened. So if a student has their reeval in 6th grade, they get it again in 9th grade, they get it again in 12th grade. If they have it in 8th grade, they would have it in 11th grade. If they had it in 7th grade, they would have it in 10th grade. So there's no guarantee that it's going to fall in the 9th grade year. Now, as a team, you can decide to do another reevaluation, whether it's time for their 3-year or not, and that's a different story. But at that point, it's not their 3-year reevaluation. So you might have done one in 10th grade, and so really another one wouldn't be due by the time that the student graduated. But if you, as an IEP team, think that you need additional information in 12th grade, you can, decide that you want that. So I just wanted to make that clear, that that is not a given that that will happen. You would have to talk about it as a team and decide to do it. The second thing that they talked about in that same paragraph is IQ testing. And Iowa does not do IQ testing anymore. Other states do. I have friends that worked in Illinois, and I know that Illinois does do IQ testing. Iowa does not do IQ testing. And there are certain assessments that are written for IQ that also cover other things. For instance, a couple years ago I had a student that had memory deficits. Well, an IQ test that's used in Iowa also has subtests that look at that information. And in my sector, I had to get special permission to have one of the psychs issue the memory deficits part of that IQ assessment, because we no longer do IQ assessments. The other thing I want to talk about is in chapter 10 on page 150, where it talks about grading options. That creates some problems sometimes in our schools. If you see there, they talk about pass, fail, traditional letter grades, competency checklist, contracts, performance grades. If you have a student that is graduating, you've got a level 1 student, you are rarely, so rarely, going to talk about pass, fail, or other types of grading options. Even with a level 2, that's going to be pretty rare. I know that in one of the districts where I worked as an AEA consultant last year or the year before, there was a student who was a level 2 student, and the teachers wanted to do pass-fail with that student. The problem is the parents did not want it. The teachers had started it, the parents found out, the parents were unhappy because they had determined that their child was going to go to college. And when you change over to that type of grading, it can have an impact on their GPA, and the parents did not want that impact to happen. Also, those students that were doing that were either in 10th or 11th grade when that got switched to a pass-fail. And that's also something that's kind of questionable. Because if you have students that need that type of supporting as far as changing what their expectations are for grading, you should know that by the time they enter high school. That should be a part of their IEP. And if you remember on page B, where it talks about what the student has to do to graduate, and you're listing all those credits, which is what had happened with them for 9th grade and 10th grade, and then 11th grade came and the teachers wanted to change it, and did so without talking to the parents, or did so without making it part of an IEP team conversation, that's not really appropriate. Like I said, when they start high school, you should know that a student needs that type of support, and that is typically a level 3 student, which you wouldn't even have as a Strat 1. It could occasionally be a low level academically, level 2 student, but again, you should know that when they start high school, that they're not going to be able to meet the types of requirements that high school wants as far as credits. So that should be a conversation that starts before they even start high school. Not something that you change partway through. And also, another important thing to remember is that grades are not really a special education concern. You know, special education teachers are supposed to be teaching strategies, finding accommodations to help students be able to access the gen ed curriculum. For Strat 1, I'm talking Strat 1 here, and that's what your endorsement is. When you have teachers, Strat 1 teachers, thinking about grading, you're worried about things other than what your area of responsibility typically is. Lots of gen ed teachers try to get special ed teachers to use resource time to work on homework completion and maybe reteaching. Resource time is to teach strategies, to work on helping students start to generalize what they've learned into maybe secondary content area secondary content areas, and you want them to teach them to use those strategies you've been teaching to access the curriculum that's in those secondary content classes. But you are not and should not be worried about, are they going to pass and fail? That's what the gen ed teachers should worry about. You know, these students, in addition to receiving special ed services, they're still part of that gen ed population too. And if a student that doesn't get special ed services is struggling with grades or needing maybe some homework help, that student goes to the gen ed content area teacher. So should your student. You should not be worried about them, whether they're getting their homework done. You should not be providing homework assistance during resource time, because resource time is specially designed instruction time. And specially designed instruction should not look like what every other gen ed kid is getting. It's totally different. It's specialized. Otherwise, if they don't need that specially designed instruction, why are they in your resource class? You know what I'm saying? So that's really hard for special ed teachers, because we want our kids to do well. We want them to be successful. We don't want them failing classes. But if we're worried about grades instead of worried about giving them the tools they need to access that gen ed curriculum, nothing is going to change in their world. They're constantly going to be struggling and needing help instead of learning how they can access it and learning to generalize the skills that you're giving them to access it. And honestly, Iowa, I don't know if I've said this, is number 50 in the nation for academic achievement for special education students. 50. We are last place for special education students. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we are spending so much time worrying about homework and what they're getting for grades instead of giving them the strategies they need so that they can earn those grades because they understand how to access that curriculum. So that's all I wanted to touch base on those last two chapters. That's a couple of important things I feel that you'll need to know as you go out into your teaching places for special ed.